You've seen the headlines, right? Government shutdown looms. It sounds really serious, but let's be honest, it can also be incredibly confusing. What does it actually mean for the US government to shut down? Well, today we're going to break it all down and figure out exactly what happens when the money stops.
So let's just tackle that big question right from the start. When you hear this on the news, what is actually going on behind the scenes? It's not like someone just flips a giant off switch for the whole country. Nope. It's a legal process with very specific rules and very real consequences.
All right, let's dive in by starting with the absolute basics. To really get what a shutdown is, we first have to understand a few key terms. Now, you might hear these thrown around interchangeably, but they actually mean very different things.
Okay, so everything, and I mean everything, starts with something called a funding gap. The easiest way to think about this is that the government's bank account for a specific agency or program has officially hit zero. The legal permission from Congress to spend money, it's expired, and no new permission has been given.
And here's a super common misconception. A funding gap is not the shutdown itself. A shutdown is the consequence of a funding gap. It's the action the government is legally forced to take because the money has run out. You got it? The gap is the cause, the shutdown is the effect.
So what law forces this to happen? It's called the Anti-Deficiency Act. And you can think of this as the legal backbone of this entire process. It's the law with teeth. It basically says that government officials are forbidden from spending money they don't have. So, the moment a funding gap happens, this law kicks in and forces federal agencies to start powering down any operations that aren't deemed absolutely essential.
So, we know what a shutdown is, right? It's a legally required pause button on non-essential services. But now for the big question. Why does this even happen? How does the US government get into a situation where it just runs out of money? Well, it all comes down to the annual funding process.
You know, in a perfect world, the process is pretty straightforward. The president proposes a budget, Congress debates and passes a series of 12 big spending bills to fund everything from the military to national parks, and then the president signs them into law before the new fiscal year starts on October 1st. But, as you can probably guess, it rarely works out that perfectly.
So the goal, the A+ assignment, is to pass those full-year regular appropriations bills on time. But more often than not, as that October 1st deadline gets closer and the big bills aren't done, Congress uses a little trick. It's a temporary patch called a continuing resolution, or just a CR. Think of it as a short-term, stopgap bill that just keeps the lights on and buys everyone a little more time to negotiate.
And here we are. This is the moment of truth. A shutdown happens when there is such a deep political disagreement that lawmakers and the president can't agree on the long-term, full-year funding bills, and they also can't agree on a short-term CR to just kick the can down the road. When both of those options fail, a funding gap becomes inevitable. Now, all this political gridlock has a massive, massive human impact. I mean, the federal government employs millions of people. So what happens to them? Who gets sent home and who has to keep coming into work?
During a shutdown, the federal workforce basically gets split into two big groups. First, you have accepted employees. These are folks whose jobs are legally considered essential for protecting life and property. They are required to show up. Everyone else is furloughed. They get sent home and are legally forbidden from doing their jobs. I mean, they can't even check their work email.
So what does an accepted job actually look like? Well, we're talking about things like national security operations, air traffic controllers, federal law enforcement, medical care at VA hospitals, and emergency responders. These are the functions the government decides absolutely cannot stop for the safety of the country. And to really get a sense of the scale of this disruption, check this out. During the big shutdowns in 1995 and 2013, around 800,000 federal workers were furloughed on day one. 800,000. That's like telling nearly the entire population of a city like Denver to just stop working overnight. The impact is just enormous.
Okay, this brings us to one of the most pressing and, let's be real, controversial questions about a shutdown. What happens to people's paychecks?
This table really lays it all out. During a shutdown, both the furloughed employees, the ones sent home, and the accepted employees, the ones still working, do not get paid. Their paychecks stop. Now, by law, after the shutdown is over, they do get full retroactive back pay. But for weeks or even a month, they go without an income. That doesn't help when rent is due. Now, look at that third row. Members of Congress, they continue to get paid.
So why is that?
Well, it's because their salaries are funded totally differently. They're paid through a permanent appropriation that was passed way back in 1981. This is also backed up by the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, which basically prevents any law changing their salaries from taking effect until after an election. So long story short, their pay isn't part of the annual funding fight that causes a shutdown in the first place.
You know, it's really easy to think of shutdowns as just a normal part of politics these days, but they are actually a pretty recent thing. For most of American history, this just isn't how things worked at all.
This quote from a 1981 government report tells you everything you need to know. For decades, when these funding gaps happened, federal agencies mostly just kept working. Sure, they'd cut back on non-essential spending, but the common belief was that Congress never actually meant for the entire government to just grind to a halt over a temporary budget fight.
So what was the big change? Well, the turning point came in 1980 and 1981. The Attorney General at the time, a guy named Benjamin Civiletti, issued a couple of legal opinions that totally reinterpreted the Anti-Deficiency Act. He basically argued that the law wasn't just a suggestion, it was a strict legal order. He said that without money from Congress, agencies were legally required to shut down. And just like that, the modern government shutdown was born.
And ever since those opinions, we've seen a whole series of major shutdowns, often driven by really intense partisan battles. In the winter of 95 and 96, a shutdown lasted 21 days. In 2013, it was 16 days. And then the shutdown from late 2018 into early 2019 went on for 34 days, making it the longest in all of U.S. history.
All told, since our modern budget process was put in place, there have been 20 different funding gaps that have interrupted government operations. 20 times. That's 20 times that the most basic function of our government, just funding itself, has broken down because of political disagreement.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty important question to think about. Given their history and their increasing use as a political bargaining chip, have these high-stakes showdowns, which were once a total anomaly, now become a permanent and accepted tool in the American political playbook? That is definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us.